so long as the door is held open for a nuclear deal predicated on the JCPOA, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, any attempt to try to stand with the protesters by naming and shaming their oppressors, or by trying to find workouts for the internet, or by continuing to keep the issue in the news, will be dampened, will be muted, because ultimately the overall policy would be enriching their oppressors.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thank you for joining us. We have an important and topical interview for you today with Iran scholar Behnam Ben Taleblu. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. Also, we would love to hear from you. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. One programming note: we'll be taking the next week off for Sukkot, so our next program will come out after the conclusion of that holiday on October 20th. And now to today's program. The world has been riveted by images of the protests in Iran as women and men have taken to the streets of Tehran and dozens of other cities in that country to demonstrate against the oppression of the Islamist regime. But it's important to remember that this isn't the first time we've seen just how desperate the people of Iran are for change. In 2009, the Iranian people also took to the streets to register their rage at being held down by the Ayatollahs. Then it was a rigged election for president that was the issue. Today, it's focused on the way the regime's morality police have intimidated, harassed, arrested, tortured, and murdered Iranian women in order to force them to dress and behave according to the demands of their theocratic masters. The question is, what will the West do to help? To his credit, President Joe Biden called out the regime and expressed support for the protesters at the UN last month. This administration has also supported efforts to restore internet service in Iran, which the regime has shut down in order to aid their repression. It's also a change from the silence of the Obama administration, in which Biden and most of his foreign policy team served, when they were faced with a choice as to whether to aid the protesters in 2009. Those protests came only weeks after Obama's infamous speech to the Muslim world delivered in Cairo, in which he compared Israel's treatment of the Palestinians to the Holocaust and apologized for all of America's alleged sins against Muslims. That was the start of his efforts to appease Iran that would culminate in the 2015 nuclear deal that enriched and empowered the regime and that essentially helped to pay for and enable the oppression that is the current cause of the demonstrations. But while it's good that Biden is behaving differently, the problem is that he spent the last 20 months chasing after the Iranians, trying to reverse the Trump administration's policies that aimed at creating maximum pressure on Iran. While Democrats spend a lot of time trying to claim that Republicans are waging a war on women because of differences over abortion, what they need to come to terms with is that their foreign policy has essentially been aimed at supporting the real war on women that is being waged by Iran's leaders. Moreover, though the nuclear talks are currently on hold because of the Iranians' relentless push for more and more American concessions, there is every reason to believe that those talks will resume after the November midterm elections, when Biden will feel less inhibited by criticisms of his policies and might make even more concessions to Iran. That places America's current support for the Iranian demonstrators in context. So long as Biden is still committed to signing an even weaker nuclear agreement with Iran that will send it even more cash and indicate that America is once again anointing it as the region's strong horse, no one can really believe that it is on the side of the Iranian people against their oppressors. The corporate liberal media that is still acting as an echo chamber on Iran for the Democrats, likes to treat the issue of the regime's abuse of human rights as separate from that of the nuclear issue. But the two are actually inextricably tied together. So long as the West is willing to enrich and empower Iran in the form of a new nuclear deal, it will be able to go on oppressing and killing women on the streets of its cities. If Biden and the Democrats, who defended and fought for Obama's destructive Middle East vision, really want to help the women of Iran, they must do more than pay lip service to their plight at the UN. They must renounce their nuclear delusions. And as bitter a pill as it will be for them to swallow, they must accept that Trump's efforts to weaken the Islamist regime with tougher sanctions is the only rational policy to pursue. Now, to discuss Iran, the nuclear talks, the demonstrations going on there now, we're pleased to have with us Behnam Ben Taleblu. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Iranian security and policy issues. Welcome to Top Story.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, it's a pleasure having you with us. The timing is good. This issue is very important right now. Your area of expertise on Iran, it's in the news. And I want to start by asking you about the current demonstrations going on in Iran. There have been protests against the regime before, over the last decade, most memorably in 2009. Can you give us some idea and some context of why they're happening now, and what are their prospects for actually influencing the regime to change?
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned that historical context and that flashpoint, which is very vivid in the eyes of many American followers of Iran or people even just genuinely interested in the region. Because in 2009, you had a Democratic administration in Washington trying to tempt Tehran's theocrats with nuclear diplomacy. There were street protests, and indeed, you had the death of a young Iranian woman whose name we all know and remember, Neda Agha Sultan. She was shot by a paramilitary sniper. And now, fast forward many years later, you have almost the same thing again. You have a Democratic administration in Washington looking to tempt Tehran's theocrats back into that same nuclear deal, and massive protests across not just Tehran, but across Iran this time. Protests have been reported in every single one of Iran's 31 provinces. So this is not just a phenomenon, a political phenomenon for the urban elite in the capital. This is across the whole country. And yet again, there was another young Iranian woman who had her whole life ahead of her, Mahsa Amini, a Kurdish Iranian woman, 22 years old, killed over allegedly violating that country's discriminatory and mandatory hijab laws. So this is an issue that has really been with us, and it's pretty salient in the American body politic, because even the current National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, mentioned on television that the administration was looking to draw a contrast with the way the Obama administration handled the Green Movement in 2009, and you've had many political commentators talk about that.
Right. I mean, and I could just the context in 2009 was that Neda's murder and those protests happened just weeks after Obama had given his Cairo speech, where he famously apologized for everything that America had ever done to the Muslim world, compared Israel's treatment of the Palestinians to the Holocaust, and seemed to signal really a real pivot in terms of the United States policy. It's a little different now, and also I think people in the Biden administration see that was not a good look in retrospect. But how different is it really in terms of how this is going to play out, I guess, is the question.
It's good that the Biden administration is at least trying to rhetorically embrace the protesters. There's been some sanctions. I think there need to be much more. There's been a brief kind of carving out or watering down of some Treasury licenses as regards to telecommunications technology, potentially allowing Iranians, access to VPNs and things of that nature, so they can more freely communicate with one another and get out of what the regime itself calls a halal internet, which is basically a national intranet where it can basically selectively or totally shut off the country's internet from the outside and only permit or filter certain sites that are permitted or halal. But if I can, we shouldn't necessarily reward the Biden administration for being measured by the very, very low bar of the way the Obama administration acted in 2009.
No, indeed.
So I think there's a lot of room for improvement here. And just back to the tail point of your first question, after 2009 in Iran, you basically had just under a decade of sustained labor protests, strikes across Iran, things that didn't really make it to the front pages of the major mainstream American press. But each political setback, those economic, social, and even religious protests had between 2009 and 2017 set the stage for what we've been witnessing in the past half decade, which is an entire national population moving away from reform, not looking to change one or two or three policy priorities, not willing to pin its hopes on even one vector of an increasingly narrow regime elite, but they're looking to be done with the regime in its entirety. And you see that in protester demography, geography, the number of protests we've had since 2017, and the fact that protests were sustained even during periods of peak foreign pressure. And I'm, here talking about the Trump era economic sanctions, because as those sanctions battered the Islamic Republic's economy, you had sustained pressure on the ground against the regime, basically busting the myth that sustained rhetorical support of the protesters would be the kiss of death, and busting the myth that if you pressured the regime, you would basically crack the domestic protest movement. It basically required Washington to throw out all the assumptions it had about protesters in Iran. And it showed you the political resolve of these protesters. 2017, 18, 19. In 2019, 1,500 Iranians were killed, at least, according to Iranian internal estimates, in massive protests that were triggered by a spike in high oil prices. In May 2022, we just had protests again. So the window between each protest is shrinking because the Iranian people are continuing to signal that they'll use every available opportunity. An economic shock, an exogenous shock, a social issue, an environmental issue. If you remember, there was protests after the downing of the Ukraine airliner in 2020. Every available opportunity can and will be taken by the Iranian people. And so therefore, it's no shock that we've had a massive response after the brutal killing of Mahsa Amini, and the way the Iranian population, and in particular Iranian women, have been bravely contesting the hijab issue. But it's no longer just limited to the hijab, and it's no longer just limited to the economy. And that opens the question, what is Western and what is Washington's policy in the face of all of this?
Yeah, I want to hone in on one thing you said, that the Iranian people are done with the regime, that they don't want to reform it, they want to get rid of it. However, the question is the regime done with power? And to date, there is no sign of that. And if there are any iron laws of history, it is that tyrannies fall not so much because of a lack of popularity, but because they lose the will or the ability to repress the people under their control. That was, I can cite many examples of that, but perhaps the best is the one from Iran itself in 1979, when the Shah of Iran either lacked the will or could not get the army under his control to basically kill people the way the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the other security services have always been willing to kill in order to preserve the Islamist regime in Tehran. So my question for you is, to the extent that we can answer this question at all from the outside, is this regime tottering to the point where it cannot command the security forces to keep killing people in order to sustain itself?
It's an interesting question, and it's one that we can only partially answer, as you mentioned, from the open source looking outside in, and whatever the direction our answers or wherever the data leads us, one can only admire the bravery of Iranian protesters who, despite knowing this fact, despite knowing that they are outgunned and outarmed, essentially, continue to stay on the streets, both during this iteration as well as past iterations of protest. Unfortunately, the regime has spent a lot of time and money thinking about this issue, and they've created a very layered and stratified security force architecture.
Yeah, they know the history too, don't they?
Exactly. And you mentioned history. Khamenei himself, the country's supreme leader, who has not been heard from in quite a while. There were allegations and even a report in the New York Times earlier in September about his health issues. As we know, he's 83. He's one of the Middle East's, or if not the world's longest running dictators. He's held the job of supreme leader for a little over 3 decades, if I'm not mistaken. That is a title meant to be taken very literally, supreme leader of Iran. And in this instance, there's a playbook for the likes of Khamenei's security forces. And they have vigilantes They have law enforcement forces, which is basically the national police, which has several branches, one of which is the morality police that brutally killed Masa Amini. Another one is the special units that the US has sanctioned, called the Yegan Vijay. Then, of course, you obviously have the Basij, the paramilitary, which is incorporated into the next level up, which is the ground forces of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Then you have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps itself. And the regime has selectively deployed mixes and matches of this cocktail to different provinces in different times, and sometimes withdrew entirely from provinces to try to tire out protesters. Other times doubled down, a mass repression on the street coupled with a mass targeted internet blackout in that area to try to hide the repression. But they're literally using weapons of war on their own population. And you're absolutely right to try to point to the 1979 analogy, and I'll bring up two older historical monarchs related to it. One is that many used to call the Shah, the suitcase monarch, because when things got tough, he left. That is the exact opposite of Iran's Ayatollahs. They know they have nowhere to go, and they are fighting because they know precisely how much the population is against them. I mean, literally, the population is attacking the Islamist and revolutionary identity, and no one knows how much more of a margin they are in Iran than Iran's increasingly narrow regime elite, both the military and the clerical establishment, as well as the political establishment. And the reason, even if, and let's hope it doesn't get put down, but even if these protests are put down, the reason there will be another is that the state versus society divide in that country continues to grow massively. And fundamentally, you have a revolutionary and an Islamist government in charge of a post-revolutionary and nationalist society. And that fundamentally cannot hold.
Well, that leads to a very direct question. You mentioned what the Biden administration is doing, which is not nothing, but it's kind of lip service at the UN. It's efforts to sort of restart the internet in Iran. There certainly could help, but unless it has the ability to get some of those, that equipment inside Iran, it's not going to do that much. So what can the West do to help the demonstrators, other than sending, their thoughts and prayers, with more statements like the ones that Biden has made?
This is also critical because it shows what our priorities are, both as Americans, but also in terms of the Western Bloc, vis-a-vis the Iranians and the policy against the Islamic Republic. I think fundamentally, and this is my view, and people can disagree, but I think fundamentally, so long as the door is held open for a nuclear deal predicated on the JCPOA, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, any attempt to try to stand with the protesters by naming and shaming their oppressors, or by trying to find workouts for the internet, or by continuing to keep the issue in the news, will be dampened, will be muted, because ultimately the overall policy would be enriching their oppressors. The people who do the foreign aggression are the same people who do the domestic repression. And Washington kind of needs to take
that's a
note.
very important point. Yeah, that's a very important point, because the IRGC, we know it to the extent that people follow Iran from the outside. We know it is sort of their terrorist, authority, but it has enormous power within Iran too, doesn't it?
It's a massive economic conglomerate. It potentially, some could say, in the absence of real, genuine political parties, affiliation with the IRGC is the most important credential for upwards advancement. That's a very interesting thing to note, because it is the theocratic regime, it is the clerical regime, it is literally the Islamic Republic. But the guys with the turbans are increasingly less relevant today, despite a whole constellation of political positions inside the Islamic Republic reserved for the guys with the turbans. So it's about where the guys with the guns go, and when they change their uniform, and when they enter the banking sector, the business sector, the quote unquote private sector, as well as, of course, national politics, be it through the parliament or other kind of political institutions. So following the origins and evolution and future of the IRGC and its veterans is, I think, a smart thing for Iran watchers to do. Many brilliantly have done that here in Washington. Many have done it around the world. But this is really one group to keep your eye on. And just to kind of tie it back to the protests again, one thing I've heard time and again from activists and people who have been on the street, left, and people who continue to talk to people on the street, is hearing non-Persian on the street, basically hearing Arabic on the street. And while that's kind of been spoken about in rumors, there's always been this fear among the protest movement that even if you do get to a point between the state and the security forces where the order to fire is given or the repressive order is given, and should that not be given, to what degree would Iran, which through the IRGC has built this massive Shiite foreign legion, the Afghan Fatimiyun, the Pakistani Zainabiyun, the multiple Shia militias that go between Iraq and Syria, and most probably famously Lebanese Hezbollah. There was always talk about this. Would they deploy the Foreign Legion at home? And there was flooding in Iran in 2018, 2019, if I'm not mistaken. And after that flooding, there were protests, and the regime did deploy the Afghan Fatimiyun and some Iraqi Shia militias to allegedly do flood reconstruction. To what degree that has been fleshed out and merged with the security forces is an intelligence question, but is one that many Iranians fear in real time.
That's a fascinating point. But of course, if we take it as a given that this regime will do everything in its power to preserve itself, why wouldn't they call in, as you well describe it, their foreign legion throughout the region, which is devoted to destabilizing other countries to stabilize their own regime? So I guess the next question is if, like every other protest against the Islamic regime has done, this one fails to create change, will the Biden administration and its European allies simply go back to business as usual on Iran? Is that the main prospect here?
Sadly, it'll be interesting to see what the administration, as well as its European partners' definition for success versus failure is. I feel like they may artificially set the bar very high, which is if unarmed protesters dislodge the government of the Islamic Republic, that's success, and then failure is everything below that. And should that hold, then I think the administration's overarching goal, which is to look at Iran through the nuclear prism, and particularly through the prism of the very politicized, fast expiring, and as you and I and many of your viewers know, fatally flawed JCPOA, then of course they would go back to business as usual. And something that has not been confirmed, but was said by Iran's foreign minister, for instance, in the aftermath of the UNGA, the same week Biden spoke, and the same week Iran's sanctioned president, who still managed to travel to the US, Ibrahim Raisi, spoke at the UNGA podium. Iran's foreign minister said that the Americans were allegedly looking to have some kind of conduct. So it makes no sense to publicly be out there trying to stand with the Iranian people and then privately trying to keep the door open for the regime, trying to keep reaching out to them while you're I don't see how this is. I understand you can have two different things in your head and be axiomatic about it, but this is not moving the US morally, strategically, or politically in the right direction by doing that. And fundamentally, it's a betrayal of the Iranian, protesters. In 2009, those protesters famously chanted, "Obama, Obama, yaba una, yaba ma," which is Obama, Obama, you with us or you with them. And throughout all these iterations of protests from 2017, you haven't had a single anti-American slogan. This is a fascinating thing to note in an area like the Middle East.
Well, you raised something I think that is a very important point in terms of the nuclear talks and the protests. Now, sort of the corporate media treats them as two completely different issues, two completely different stories. But in fact, I think you're right that they are linked. Right now, the nuclear talks are on hold, perhaps until after the midterms, perhaps not. I mean, the New York Times writes about it as if they're dead. I guess they're dead until they're not dead. But since the whole focus of Biden administration policy towards Iran has been on reviving that weak nuclear deal, which would, like the original one in 2015, enrich and empower the regime. I mean, how unless they were literally to take it off the table? I guess the next question is the effort to create a new nuclear deal, and is it really dead? And how can the administration claim to be on the side of the protesters so long as the main focus of its policy towards Iran remains one that is still after another deal that will make the regime stronger as the previous one did?
Informed minds may disagree, but I'm inclined to think that so long as there is diplomacy predicated on that fatally flawed deal, one isn't really standing with the protesters. And let's pretend this is for the uber realist class of Washington here, let's pretend for a moment that it is not about the protesters and that those protests never even happened. That would Washington handcuffing its most powerful non-military, non-kinetic tools of punishment, deterrence, and coercion for a nuclear deal that really only in select declared facilities establishes caps on some known knowns in Iran's nuclear program. Would that be worth it? And the time that you bought in 2015 was an estimated 10 years. There were some flashpoints or sunsets that would come sooner, some that would come later. But ultimately, it was a 10-year Faustian bargain. Now you don't even have that full 10 years, and you'd likely be paying more and getting less time on the clock. That seems like a fool's errand to me, even absent that new national backdrop of the Iran protest movement, which has moved to the front scene in the eyes and hearts and minds of many Americans and many around the world as that saga continues to unfold. So I think it is going to be impossible. I know that there are many who will predicate the strategy on the Reagan administration, which is to say you can talk and you can also, issue human rights sanctions or be tough on human rights. But that's fundamentally, I think, a misunderstanding of the way Reagan applied arms control to try to also make the Islamic Republic as powerful and as much of a global competitor as the Soviet Union. It would require fundamentally a large stretch. It doesn't mean we can't borrow from that playbook, but that playbook is not one-to-one, given that the adversary is not one-to-one. Arms control with a global peer competitor is different than counterproliferation with the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorists. So Washington should not forget the outsized power and outsized influence that it can and has traditionally been able to wield in this space.
Yeah, I guess my next question would be let's sort of drill down into the nuclear talks. The Iranians have sort of led the Biden administration around by the nose for 20 months. Biden and his team were absolutely convinced that Iran would rejoin the nuclear deal at the first opportunity. That was the advice that former Secretary of State, current climate czar John Kerry gave them during the Trump administration when the Trump maximum pressure policy was being applied. He said just hang tight, wait for the Democrats to win the next election, and then you'll get what you want. They did hang tight. They did not negotiate with Trump for a stronger nuclear deal, but they didn't sign one with Biden either. And some of the reports about Iran say, well, the Iranians don't really want one, or that there are factions that don't really want another nuclear deal. But the question is this something that Biden is still going to keep pushing for? Once the demonstrations are repressed, and the odds are more likely that they will be than they won't. And after the midterm elections, when the president will be sort of free from some domestic pressure, is it entirely possible that more concessions, even the ones about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, could be put back on the table in order to get this, as you well describe it, worthless deal, but which will still be trumpeted by the administration as a major foreign policy accomplishment?
There's so much there to unpack. I think it's a very rich question, Jonathan. But so long as the Biden administration builds on this other momentum that we have, not just in American politics, but in the American polity, which is basically to say, to junk the Middle East, that the only interaction were the failed experiments of Iraq and Afghanistan, and everything short of that means we have to pivot to Asia or great power competition or foreign policy for the middle class. Pick your bumper sticker of choice here. That the nuclear deal would be sold as a way to exit the region. And in this, particular political and economic climate, may also be sold as a potential oil deal or as a way to reduce energy prices rather than a counter-proliferation deal. So I see that
that's an important point right now in the context of raging inflation.
And so therefore, I see the Biden administration's attachment to this thing, not just through the policy lens and not just through the key pillar of the Democratic foreign policy establishment lens, but through a short-term political lens. To say we undid what Trump did because the trend in post-Cold War American politics is to critique and then undo your successor. You had Clinton's internationalism response to HW's realism, and we can go on. And the Obama-Bush divide was quite Trump. The Trump-Obama divide was quite sharp, and of course now Biden wants to change some things there as well. So it's a bit more of a religion in terms of philosophy and in terms of domestic politics, they're painted themselves in a bit of a tight corner here, because even if genuinely they did want to push for something that they allegedly campaigned on, which was a longer and stronger deal, the Biden administration, than the Biden campaign, they denigrated for the past 20 months, as you mentioned, the one tool that would help them get it. So throughout the campaign and into the administration, Team Biden said that sanctions don't work and that maximum pressure didn't work. And then also it's been signaling to different factions of, you could say, the far left or the far right, that military engagements are not the answer. Less is more. We got to focus on these other structural competition matters when it comes to Russia and China. Middle East doesn't matter as much, things of that nature. So it really painted itself in a box here as to other available policy options. And as the Biden administration had that debate, and I think Americans sometimes tend to forget this, America's authoritarian adversaries like Russia, China, North Korea, as well as Iran, were paying attention. There's no reason why the Iranian Foreign Ministry in 2021 should be able to produce, as it did in a very long document, paragraphs onto a particular American faction's attachment to the JCPOA. That's something that a sustained and sophisticated reading of American domestic politics, which is qualitatively different than the way the Iranians used to look at us 10, 15 years ago, provides them. It provides them with insight about our risk tolerance, about our red lines. And fundamentally, I think the Iranians have a very sticky impression of the Biden administration's risk tolerance and red lines. Just recently, Iran engaged in its second ballistic missile strike against Iraqi Kurds in the same year, in 2022, allegedly firing 72 or 73 ballistic missiles. That's one of the largest ballistic missile operations during peacetime by the Islamic Republic. And allegedly or reportedly, it even killed one American. So this is a very uncharted threshold here for the Biden administration and risk tolerance and pushing back on Iran. And I think fundamentally, the administration is so wedded to the idea of seeing Iran through the JCPOA lens for those political and policy reasons that it's going to be very, very hard for it to be disabused of that. It doesn't mean that opposition needs to necessarily become partisan. I still think there's ways to have informed sanctions scholars and arms controllers and Iran watchers to meet in the middle. But the political space to meet in that middle and have the message shared and socialized and understood is quickly eroding. And that is a detriment to U.S. national security policy.
Yeah, that brings up a couple of questions straight to mind. Let me ask one first. We've been talking about the Biden administration. We tend to think of them as sort of a blob. I mean, it's sort of the foreign policy establishment of the United States, in office. So many people were veterans of the Obama administration. Now they're working for Biden. Some in very similar, or just they failed upwards to get bigger jobs. Jake Sullivan being one. Is there, and obviously you're in Washington, you talk to people. Do you think there is any inkling of a reevaluation, whether it's because of the optics of the demonstrations in Iran, or because of what I have to imagine has been a very bitter experience for them in terms of the negotiations going on in Vienna, where the Iranians have really been playing them for fools? For a year and a half or more, they've been expecting a deal to happen, and the Iranians keep pulling the rug out from under them. Is there any chance, do you see, that, within that blob of Obama and Biden veterans, that they're capable, and I'm not even talking about the people at the very top, but even within the sort of the policy soldiers, that there's some idea of some movement within them to say, wait a minute, maybe we need to change some things, beyond just the optics of making some sound bites about saying nice things about the protesters?
This is actually a very sophisticated question, and it reminds me, I think, of a phrase that Tom Schelling used, noted political scientist, economist Tom Schelling, or maybe it was Mark Trachtenberg talking about Tom Schelling, a noted international historian, about things that are ornamental versus instrumental. And in this case, even if the Biden administration, in my view, does move towards a more vigorous enforcement of some of the sanctions that it disdains, but it nonetheless has inherited. And actually, one must give credit where credit is due. Since May, there has been one penalty a month, May, June, July, August, September, targeting either Iran's illicit oil exports or its petrochemical smuggling networks. That is good to see. That is important to see. But in the eye of the adversary, are these five enforcement actions more ornamental or instrumental to what a particular plan B could look like? And I'm willing to bet that the Iranians see this as more ornamental, that is designed to give the administration larger domestic political cover to pursue its overarching vision and worldview towards Iran, which still remains, unfortunately, JCPOA
Yeah,
centric.
if I can just interject for a moment, I mean, if there's, I mean, I have more certainty about what the Iranian regime thinks about Biden than I am about what Biden thinks about the Iranian regime, because every action that they have taken clearly shows that they have measured Biden and his team and have no respect for them, think they're just suckers, think they can do anything to them and get away with it.
Yeah, and I think the Iranians have put their money where their mouth is on this issue. It's really a question of where are we on this, and where are we on this time one, two, three on the escalation ladder. It's an unknown unknown at what point in time the Europeans, for instance, let's pivot across the Atlantic, would want to crack down on Iran's missile testing and missile transfers and missile development, for instance, because before the US comes into range of Iran's missiles, it would be Europe through intermediate range ballistic missiles before the regime ever develops intercontinental ballistic missiles. But the last time the European Union passed missile related designations and penalties against Iran was December 2012. That tells you about the pulled punches. Iran is not just reading America, it's reading the West, it's
10
reading the
years
moon.
ago. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
It's 10 years too late, 10 years too long. So there's a lot of work to be done there. But part of this is also philosophy. I'm willing to bet that a lot of key individuals between high and mid rank in the Biden administration see pressure as an impediment to rather than an aid of diplomacy. And so if you ask them to chart the story of how they got to the JCPOA, they're more likely to blame it on American concessions that we saw through the secret channel in Oman with Jake Sullivan, for instance, in the first term Obama administration, where the U.S. conceded allegedly enrichment, or they may, say it's part of Iran's changing domestic politics. So you had Rouhani at the helm, and he's a quote unquote moderate. We know the way the Obama administration sold that story with Ben Rhodes. So in the philosophy of these folks, in these tier two folks in the administration, pressure, in their view, drives the program. And Iran's, willingness to punch back, even against someone like Trump in the region 2018, 2019, 20, and then in the nuclear file 2019, 2020, and then most dangerously 2021, 2022 under Biden, shows these folks that pressure is dangerous. And I think they see everything through the lens of America is the cause, or America is the underwriter of the next stage of escalation. And therefore they have pulled their punches. And I think the what these people are most comfortable in, and if we're going to be cynical about it, is not plan A, which is diplomacy, and not plan B, which is pressure, but in the absence of a resurrection of the deal, and while everything else with the US and Iran fizzles, some kind of new normal, some kind of stasis. And I've called that a plan C, where you don't formally collapse the talks. You say you're always interested in the talks, and you hope that creates a barrier against the worst of the worst, meaning overt military action against America, or a race to 93.6% to get weapons grade uranium. And so long as those two game-changing, devastating things don't happen, you've survived, you've inched along, you've done your best to undo the Trump legacy, and you can get to 2024, 2025. This is a very cynical view, but I think it may be one that may be adopted as the Iranians punch back, and as the Iranians show that they will be tough bargainers, and as America is very hesitant to go to Plan B because philosophically they think Plan B would expand the Iranian program and underwrite the next round of pressure rather than show the Iranians who's boss and begin to rein them in a little bit. And so that's why you're going to see sanctions on the periphery, or political and military pressure on the periphery rather than at the center of the Biden administration's Iran policy. And the goal will be get to 2022, the midterms, and just get to 2024, the presidential election.
Well, I think you're pointing out a couple of really, there's a lot to unwrap in what you just said, unpack there. Clearly, I think many of us worried when the Biden administration came into office that the people that were being put in place to run foreign policy believed in diplomacy for its own sake, that it was an end in and of itself. And certainly the way it's conducted policy with Iran, I think validates that. They're all about just keeping the talks going. And when you talk about your plan C, that's a fascinating scenario. To me, it sounds very much like not so, on the one hand, yes, it totally makes sense to me that they would just, the talks would, would always be there on the horizon, kind of like the talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians and the views of sort of veteran State Department peace process. It's, it's a ship that's always sailing, but that it also ultimately means acquiescence to Iran being, at the very least, a threshold nuclear power. And that means Iran can get as close to a weapon, as they want with impunity.
One hopes that's not the case, but hope is not a strategy, as we all know. But it just means, again, fundamentally, and I think fundamentally, these folks don't want an Iranian nuclear weapon either. Let's not be shy about it. I think that everything we are discussing, and we
Well,
are,
it would be embarrassing if nothing
it,
else.
it would be grossly embarrassing and a strategic setback and a game changer. And again, from the perspective of the protest movement in Iran, that would in some ways attempt to ensure the regime's survival, even at the time of potential political succession and transition and everything with Khamenei's health. Remember, the Islamic Republic has only been around for 43 years, and it's only had two supreme leaders in that time. And the way each one came about was, shall we say, rather unorthodox. So it in some ways would ensure the regime at a time when it seems to be, and in fact, looking at the streets, is most shaky. So it has a lot of follow-on ramifications there as well. Uh, but here at home, it's because we just don't agree on tools, targets, timelines, and risk tolerance. There was a time that sanctions resolutions on Iran were flying out of the Congress, flying out of the Senate, 98-1, 99-0. I think those days are gone. I hope they're not gone forever. There is, a lot of good resolutions moving in the House now. You can just look at the Congress.gov website. At least the Iran protest movement has managed to get people on the left and right to think creatively, or at least message the right way on this issue. But how sustainable is it? I don't know, because there's a very different attention span here, and there's a very different interest set here. And so long as the Biden administration continues to have pressure be ornamental and on the sidelines, it means that none of this has changed. And I'm remiss to even make this point. I think it's much better to build bridges in Washington than to burn them, both socially, politically, and professionally. But some of the people at the helm also signal that there is no plan B. If you have a devotee as your Iran czar, for instance, of the JCPOA, it signals to the Iranians as well as to the American population that you never have closed the door on that
Yeah,
deal.
what you're talking about, Robert Malley. Yeah.
Yeah, like, indeed. And ultimately, these are choices that the administration makes every day, even by not acting. This is just food for thought. Um, and I'm just putting this out there because I think the Iranians have been watching it, obviously from a distance, but they too are taking stock of our timelines, of our personalities, of our philosophies, of our risk tolerance. And again, I think we forget this. American domestic politics has been, in so many ways, this past half decade, or perhaps even decade, so public, and our feuds with each other over issues, tools, targets have been so public that our adversaries are taking note. And I'll just get into this one minor footnote this way. If you remember in the 2020 election, one of the ways Iran was trying to do the election spoofing and election hacking was to grab onto, the fourth rail, violence in American politics, by trying to spoof Proud Boy emails. Look at the level of understanding of this adversary and of what it saw American society going through in 2020. Lest we forget, in 2020, the year of the pandemic, Rouhani virtually addressed the UNGA. He talked about the George Floyd protests. In 2021, Raisi addressed the UNGA virtually. He talked about January 6th. The Islamic Republic is looking to put its hand on every potential fissure to stop American pressure. The question is America even cognizant of the fissures in this regime, or of the leverage available to it? And why is it not putting its hands on those levers?
Well, that's an excellent point. So my question, I think really goes even beyond the fact that, as you rightly say, we're kind of involved in a political culture war in this country, which is undermining so many things in terms of our democracy, and it's really no way to run a country, no way to conduct public discourse, but it's where we're heading. But when we speak of Iran policy, I think the question I have to ask, even though both of us follow this issue very closely, um, most Americans do not. There have been moments when Iran got into the headlines, and yes, people are noticing the demonstrations. But one of the things that sort of supporters of the nuclear deal always had, is that most Americans, even most Republicans, were not willing to go to the mat over this issue. The Republican leadership in the Senate got rolled by Obama in terms of presenting it as an agreement rather than a treaty. Um, Today, I think there is even less interest in foreign policy. The only wars Americans care about tend to be the ones against each other. Um, so I have to really ask a question I don't think either of us want to answer, but is there a credible threat to Iran from an American government and an American people that isn't focused on them at all, even in terms of the issues of last year or the issues of this year? Certainly, and there was a certain degree, and there was also a certain degree of continuity even between Trump and Biden, as much as Biden wanted to overturn Trump's Iran policy, in terms of wanting to get out of the Middle East. Trump was willing to hit terrorists hard. He killed Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force within the IRGC, but he wasn't really interested in another war, or in starting a full-scale conflict, or in going to the mat with Iran, as much as his maximum pressure policy, I think, made sense. So how, when the Iranian regime looks at the United States, why would they think that either Democrats or Republicans would really ever hold them accountable when push came to shove?
This is very fascinating because I think a little while ago, there's an IRGC official whose name escapes me, but was talking about the national security threats to the Islamic Republic. And number one was Israel. He talked about America amplifying the Israeli threat to Iran, particularly to the Islamic Republic. Uh, but number one was the lesser Satan, or the little Satan, not the great Satan. This tells you that the cadre at the helm and the cadre doing the fighting sees the region very differently. I think a different point in the 43-year, Islamic Republic U.S. Relationship would have answered that question very differently, particularly in the 1980s with the Reagan administration, Operation Praying Mantis in the Persian Gulf, sinking, a third of the Iranian Navy in minutes, for instance. Um, there would have been a different answer to that question. And the Iranian experience in this case is not only conditioned by the partisan debates about the JCPOA, but about the fights in the heartland of the Middle East, where it now has laissez-passer more than ever before, in Iraq, in Syria, and potentially even Lebanon, Yemen, potentially even less so Bahrain and Afghanistan, other places where there is proxy activity, for instance. And the ascendancy of their strategy in these theaters and their ability to create what they call in their own terms, axis of resistance, and arm them with some of the most lethal weapons and the full range of unmanned aerial threats, drones, mortars, rockets, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and amplify the threat that the state poses, and now have all the proxies also pose that threat. And to other states like Israel, for instance, begin to move the knife closer and closer and closer to the neck on a whole host of different geographies, which is designed to erode the Israeli national security apparatus's room for maneuver and policy planning over time. It's not a one and done. It's a slow, steady strangulation that the regime is trying to, enact here. And at the same time, in the Persian Gulf, a slow, steady eviction of U.S. forces from the region. And in this sense, the U.S. may actually aid and abet the rise of the Islamic Republic's regional power by withdrawing prematurely, or constantly playing politics with missile defense assets, or constantly playing politics with carrier deployments, things of that nature. Now, a footnote to that is capabilities does not always translate well in the eyes of one adversary as resolve of another actor. Meaning, the U.S. has had a large conventional military posture in the Middle East for quite some time now. It's been more selective about it in other theaters, but it's been pretty capable. But the Islamic Republic has chipped away at it over time. And in their own language, the non response to the ballistic missile barrage after the killing of Soleimani is because, and this is what the commander of the aerospace force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said, and he has operational control of the Middle East's largest ballistic missile arsenal. He said America didn't act when the Iranians shot at those two bases because they were afraid of Iranian missile power. They were deterred by Iranian missile power. When that thinking calcifies, you get exactly what you see now in the region, which is more and more and more missile testing, more and more missile transfers, and more missile use during peacetime. It drops the threshold for the use of these dangerous weapons, which fly so fast, or in the case of drones, low and slow. But nonetheless, it means that the threat will become more and more lethal. And my fear is that the people who don't want war will actually get us into an accidental war quite easily.
Wow. That is a very frightening scenario. And I'll just, one more question. I think one of the debates that the Obama administration engendered among its critics was trying to probe what exactly was the purpose of its policy. Obama said he wanted Iran to to give them an opportunity to get right with the world, even though Iran clearly had no interest in getting right with the world in the way that was meant. But there were also people who claimed that by appeasing Iran, the United States, at least under Obama and possibly Biden, was essentially going beyond an attempt at a rapprochement, but essentially reorienting American policy away from its allies and toward Iran. There's certainly some elements in Europe and those who hope to profit from the end of sanctions that are in favor of that. But has that ever been a viable strategy? I mean, what could that possibly lead to?
The only, this is my view, as an Iranian American, the only instance where that even may be a possible strategy or a viable option is if you ever have a genuinely representative and democratic Western-leaning polity in Iran that is reflective of the views and values of the Iranian people. Then we can talk about equitably sharing the region. Then we can talk about things like burden sharing among newer allies. Then you wouldn't have to have a Saudi-Iranian Cold War, or potentially you leveraging things like peace negotiations like the Abraham Accords to also have a security component to it. You could have those things be born out of the genuine desire for friendship. And hypothetically, you could have the Sunni powerhouse and the Shiite powerhouse racing to become more pro-Israel, more pro-Western. Those are things you could do if some of the pieces were fundamentally transformed. So
it's a pretty messianic vision you're giving us here.
It's also very, very hopeful. But in pivoting to the reality of the region, and I think the thesis of the Obama administration's approach to try to do what you mentioned in the question, which is to empower Iran potentially, that comes from conflating Iran, the state, and the civilizational entity with the Islamic Republic, the 43-year brutish government there. And that once that conflation happens, that allowed for the transformative ethos of the JCPOA. Because at the heart of the JCPOA is a transaction between centrifuges and sanctions, a Faustian bargain for essentially 10 years that paves the pathway for a potential nuclear weapon. And you hope in this time either there's a revolution or Khamenei dies or the Islamic Republic remains but becomes more responsible, or it's very hopeful. And it's hopeful in a way that restrains America and empowers the current adversary. You saw what an uneven exchange the JCPOA was in the years that it was in force. But ultimately, the Biden administration has pivoted away from that transformative ethos, but still wants that transactive fruit of that deal. At a time when the fruit is proving itself to be even more and more rotten and not being able to yield the things that we want for U.S. national security. But the fact that even they have learned that there should be nothing transformative here. The Biden administration is not at all talking about changing the behavior or changing the U.S.-Iran relationship. Those were things the Obama administration routinely thought of and, put the weight of history incorrectly on the wrong actor on the wrong time. So hopefully that's one small lesson. Hopefully learning from the Green Movement is another. But again, as we mentioned, hope is not a strategy. You have to build, you have to put your money where your mouth is. And so long as the Iranians are willing to run more risks, they will have more interest that they're willing to put more national, resources behind. And that creates a very uneven competition between a relationship, the US and Iran, which is very uneven on paper, because the Iranians are always talking about now, the Islamic Republic, as I should say, the balance of resolve, not the balance of capability. It's not who can do it, it's who wants it more. And I think this is where the mismatch is going to be in the next 5, 10, 15 years on US policy in the Middle East. Not what can we do empirically on paper, but what have we done and what will we do? And when it comes to using that conventional military architecture, it's not just about deterrence by denial. It potentially may need to be about deterrence by punishment. What does the other side believe they have to lose? Is it just every time they fire a missile, the missile will be blocked? Or is there a greater cost than the value, the economic value of the missile that the regime or the proxy will lose in every iteration of this conflict? And it's a very uneven proposition. There's a lot to unpack there. There's an economic angle, a political angle. But we are in for a very messy future ahead, if not only because of the adversary's understanding of our domestic politics, but our domestic politics' disunited understanding of the adversary.
How does this situation with instability in Iran, and briefly, some of the time we have left, how does this impact Iran's efforts to support terrorist groups and destabilize American allies in the Gulf and Israel, and as well as which relates to the Abraham Accords as well? Are they more or less likely to escalate conflicts elsewhere, whether it's egging on another round of missile fire in Gaza, or egging on their auxiliaries in Lebanon to mess with Israel's northern border, or negotiations over gas fields there, or somehow in the Gulf? Are those options right now either to distract from its domestic woes or to up the ante with the United States?
I think fundamentally the Islamic Republic's security strategy has not changed. And I think something, proponents of pressure need to know is that this is a cost-effective security strategy. The Islamic Republic chose this because it is sustainable. It is much more sustainable financially to equip, most unfortunately, a shoeless child soldier in Syria than for the U.S. to train, arm, equip a Green Beret and then deploy and sustain logistically. This is part and parcel of their security strategy. So even in a time of crisis, it is still sustainable. The fear is escalation, as you mentioned, as they feel weak at home when they look to escalate a conflict abroad. We are just seeing that now with the multiple strikes on Iraqi Kurdistan against various Iranian Kurdish opposition groups that are there. The desire to project strength abroad when they're weak at home. Even U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan rightly pointed that out. Credit again where credit is due. And also something that went totally undernoticed in the month of September. The Houthi rebels in Yemen had a military parade in Sana'a, more than ever before, several carbon copies, at least in terms of what you could measure from the naked eye: nose cone shape, airframe shape, fin and finlet shape, missile design entirely, 3 or 4 entirely new missiles revealed directly from things we've seen in the Iranian arsenal, as well as one in the Iranian arsenal that we saw first appear in the Houthis. So the Iranians and their proxies are developing arsenals in
That's
exile,
quite a
essentially
message.
trading. Quite a message, and no one mentioned it. So that stuff, most unfortunately, marches along on a bad day, and for the regime on a good day is escalated. So I do have my worries that we may not be paying sufficient attention to some of the developments in the region.
Well, that's very frightening. Last question: can you give our viewers and listeners a recommendation for a single book or 2 books that they should be reading to better understand this situation and what's going on in Iran and the American policy and where it's going on Iran?
Oh goodness, there's such a litany of amazing and some not so amazing
So I want to
options right
give me
behind me.
1 or 2 amazing ones.
One very good one, and I did a book review of it, is by an Oxford-trained Persianist in 2013 or 2014. It's called Days of God by James Buchan. It's about the 20th century Iran-West relationship, but it's pivotal because it studies that relationship as well as political developments in Iran through the perspective of the last 2 monarchs and the first 2 mullahs. So last 2 monarchs of the Pahlavi dynasty, first 2 mullahs of the Islamic Republic, and shows you 20th and 21st century history through the lens of those 4 men. And I'm always reminded of this quote by the late, great Professor Fuad Ajami, who talked about studying biography rather than history or poli-sci if you want to know the Middle East. So even though that is a history book, it's presented through the lens of the biography of these 4 men. And to really understand partially to how we got here and to do justice to their ideologies and worldview and structural factors, I would recommend Days of God. It won't offend one side or the other side. It's just got a lot of great material, richly resourced in primary source Persian language stuff, and it's a great read.
Well, great. That's exactly what we want to give our readers, good recommendations. Thank you so much for coming on and telling us, giving us so much insight on these issues. And we really appreciate it. And we'll be following you and your writings and your insights on this as we go forward.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and for having me.
Thank you. A few final thoughts on this topic. I think we've got some really good insights on what's going on in Iran, as well as what's going on in Washington. But I think the most important thing we can take away from this conversation and the discussion about Iran in general right now is that until America gets serious about understanding what it's up against in Iran, in the regime, all of the talk about supporting protesters or marginal ideas about how we might help them, or even the supposed benefits of a return to a nuclear deal, which is actually a formula for disaster, really can't be taken as if they are getting us towards a place that will be more serious or really defend American interests or those of the West or even those of Israel. Let's understand this. The Iranian regime, there is as I said before, there is an iron law that, as long as it's willing, as long as tyrants are willing to repress their people, they will stay in power. There is no sign that this regime is loosening its grip on power. Moreover, there is no sign that this regime is at all interested in getting right with the world or in doing anything other than destabilizing the West and expanding its revolution and its terrorism. There's only one way to go with this, and that is towards a policy that seeks to, at the very least, isolate Iran, put as much pressure on it to change as possible. And anything short of that is simply a formula for a more dangerous regime, a more repressive regime, as well as one that is a threat both to Israel, the Arab states, and the United States and the West, let alone the women of Iran. If you want to help the women of Iran, stop helping the regime. Stop letting the Biden administration getting away with trying to have it both ways on both the protests and its still strong commitment to appeasement. It's true most Americans don't care that much about foreign policy, aren't paying attention to Iran, and certainly don't want to get drawn into more foreign conflicts. But unless we want that conflict to grow, unless we really do want to see a nuclear Iran, as well as an Islamist regime that is doing more than just forcing people to wear hijabs, then Americans must get serious about Iran, must get serious about the need to have an administration that is willing to evaluate all of its mistakes and start acting differently. We want to thank you, our audience, whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV. Please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. Again, we'll be taking the next week off for Sukkot, so our next program will come out after the conclusion of the holiday on October 20th. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again soon.